All right, good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us. My name is Catherine Spitz. I am an associate counsel with the Wisconsin Institute for Law and Liberty. For those of you who are not familiar with WIL and what we do, we are a 501c3 organization composed of about 9 lawyers and about half a dozen policy folks. We're committed to preserving the principles of our republic and upholding the rule of law through litigation and policymaking. Areas in which we operate include First Amendment litigation, reining in regulatory overreach, and ensuring that people are treated equally under the law. Today's issue arises on the litigation side, but it does have a policy aspect to it. Today we'll be discussing ESG, or environmental, social, and governance factors, and how they affect retirement investing. Just so everyone is aware, this webinar is being recorded, so if you need to go back and reference it at any point later, or if you want to share it around, please feel free to do so. A couple of disclaimers with the webinar today. I am an attorney, so I do disclaimers. Nothing I say today should be construed as offering you any legal or financial advice. Please consult your own attorney or financial professional for advice as it regards your particular situation or your particular retirement account. And also, while you will see some references to Tom Cruise movies in some of the slide titles, including this one, neither he nor any of those associated with the films have anything to do with any of the information or opinions I express here today. They're simply there to keep your attention because for a lot of people, the very mention of ERISA, the law governing retirement plans, has the risk of putting them to sleep. And one of my goals today is not to do that. So let's go ahead and get started. This is what we're hoping to cover today, what ESG is, why it can be problematic, the Biden administration's current and future plans for ESG-related federal regulations, a brief overview of current litigation in which WIL is involved over ESG regulations, and a couple of practical ideas for steps that you might be able to take if, after listening today, you decide that you think ESG might be a concern for you. So, what is ESG? If you don't know, or if you have only a vague idea, please don't feel badly about that. A recent Gallup poll revealed that a large proportion of Americans don't actually know what ESG stands for or what it means. Chances are, if you're really into this topic, you might know what it is. If you've been exposed to it and you really dislike it, you might know what it is. But beyond that, a large portion of the American public is not really clear on what ESG factors are or how they're used. So ESG stands for environmental, social, and governance factors. These are a range of what I like to call soft factors, as opposed to something more concrete, like a stock price or the number of units a company might produce or sell in a given year, its profits, et cetera, which I sometimes call hard or objective factors. That's not an official term. It's just a way of designating that some of these ESG factors are a little bit more amorphous and more difficult to translate into financial statements, which is often how investment decisions are made. People who describe themselves as ESG investors will often claim to be, and sometimes are, idealistic types who wax poetic about people over profits, investing in something more, and other assertions that the traditional means of selecting investments, i.e. to generate a return, are lacking. Individuals who are interested in ESG investing more commonly identify as politically liberal, but that need not be the case. There is such a thing as conservative ESG investing as well. So here's an incomplete list of the most common ESG factors that we see when it comes to discussions involving investing. The ones you hear about most often are investing based upon a company's actual or professed stance on environmental issues, or their practices regarding climate change or carbon footprint, as well as a company's commitment to so-called social justice issues, including most frequently and most recently, companies' diversity, equity, and inclusion, or DEI initiatives. Other ESG factors may include whether the company has a great culture or creates good union jobs. The one thing that all of these factors tend to have in common is that they are factors outside of the general financial analysis of whether something is profitable or not. They may be part of a whole as to whether they're profitable or not, but they're not easy to pin down what the dollar-to-dollar impact of a particular policy might be. As I mentioned a couple minutes ago, there can be conservative ESG factors too, or conservative ESG leanings. You just don't hear about them as often. If you were to select an investment because the company's leadership professes Christian values, or you choose one product over another because it's veteran owned, you are making social value judgments as well. And as we'll be discussing today, it's not that making individual purchasing choices based on these factors is problematic. It's that in the retirement context, where concepts of fiduciary duty are involved, mixing politics with the investment choice can become a real issue. So let's break these down a little bit more. Here's our environmental friend. This is the most common ESG factor that is taken into account, and that is environmental. This factor does tend to be pretty politically one-sided, though there are some funds out there that are fossil fuel energy focused that tend to trend the other way. What is good or bad, depending on your outlook, about using an environmental preference or policy stance in the ESG context is that it may not necessarily commit the company to anything. It can be a feel-good initiative that's meant to court the attention and investment dollars of a particular political constituency. The difference between ESG as a factor and certain disclosures that are required to be made by companies as is that environmental laws and regulations, which are binding on everyone, we all know what the impact of that is. If there is a spill at a company's major plant and there's litigation over it, we know that that's going to put the company at financial risk. But if a company is simply committing to cut its carbon footprint in half over the next 25 years, we don't know necessarily how that's going to affect the bottom line and the company's valuation in the short term, the midterm, or the long term, at least not yet. So that's sort of the difference between what is binding and what is not in the ESG context as far as environmental factors can go. The S, or the social in ESG, has really assumed a position of prominence in recent years. Many of you might recall in the summer of 2020 just how many of the nation's corporations with just zero ties to the city of Minneapolis or policing in general issued statements backing the Black Lives Matter movement and other similar social movements and events in the wake of the George Floyd incident. How many companies donated portions of profits, which could otherwise have gone to shareholders or been reinvested in the company to benefit shareholders, to prop up certain social causes or social issues. In addition, under this S factor, the proliferation of diversity initiatives has skyrocketed in recent years, with accompanying social pressure to promote those initiatives. These sorts of programs, along with those I have listed on the screen here, are the most common social factors when it comes to ESG investing. And one important caveat that I want to note here, I'm not here today to say that diversity is bad. In some industries, you might have a competitive advantage by putting a diversity program in. You might be able to point to a link between yourselves and your diversity program and profitability if you have such a program. Certainly, many companies may have a target market or a typical customer. There's nothing inherently wrong or unlawful with targeting, for example, your advertising dollars to certain demographics or certain areas where you think you're going to get more return. But more of the recent movements in terms of the activities I've just mentioned, such as donating to certain political causes or coming out and taking public stances on social issues, most of those have nothing to do with the aspect of return for the company. It's been pure virtue signaling and pandering to a social media crowd. The idea being, invest in my company, just look how much I care. And that's a little bit more difficult, again, to translate into dollars and cents than is, for example, targeting a particular market. And finally, governance, the G in ESG. It's most often overlooked by a lot of people because it's a less glamorous and less frequently discussed aspect of how companies are run. This may include conflict of interest policies for board members, quotas for board membership in terms of representation by certain groups, policies for board members on political lobbying, and limits for payment for officers or top management at the company. So if a company votes to put a cap or a ceiling on what the CEO or the front office people make in a publicly traded company, that might be a governance issue. If a company has a 9-member board and they make a commitment that at least 4 of those seats are going to be filled by women, that would be a governance factor that might be taken into account on the G in ESG. Okay, so with all of this in mind, why are people so interested in ESG investing, those that are? ESG investing has become popular with certain aspects of the population because people believe it's an effective way to either vote their values or at least look like they're doing so. Again, sort of the virtue signaling, look how much I care aspect of things. There is some appeal to this. You and I, we make value judgments every day in our purchasing decisions. So the thought train goes, why not carry it over into our retirement investments? I might buy this product over that product because of a celebrity endorsement that I saw, or I might avoid purchasing from someone else because they publicly support a cause that I don't like. There are conservative ESG funds and companies as well, though they're not nearly as common. The issues that I'll be discussing shortly with regard to retirement investments would apply equally to whether the fund is conservative or liberal. So I think it's important to emphasize today that this will be, it's not a political battle necessarily. It's not a political battle between woke and conservative. It's a battle between involving politics and putting politics where it doesn't belong. So there is some appeal to that, and that's why a lot of people want to be involved. I also want to make one other caveat here, and that is that I'm not saying that ESG investments may not pay off big in some contexts, right? If you take Elon Musk and the associated political firestorm with Twitter out of it for a moment, who wouldn't have wanted to get in on the ground floor with Tesla or Apple or Amazon before they really exploded in value? You'd love to be the person who made that call and got in early. And maybe you're going to be really rich in 10 years, but maybe the company is going to go belly up in 6 months. So those are things to consider when we talk about risk and the impact of ESG on investing. I'm not saying that ESG is never a viable option. And again, we're not saying that this is a policy good or bad thing necessarily in every instance. But when it comes to retirement investing, there's a reason that politics should be kept out of it. And part of that is because we are looking at a number of risks that can come up in the ESG context. So many of the, as I note here, many of the policies translate into extra costs that eat into the bottom line. So herein lies the dilemma, right? It's often a lot cheaper to rely on, say, coal-powered or natural gas-powered electricity, a proven technology, than it is to pledge to use the new wind plant that's scheduled to be built in 2 years. It can be more expensive to administer plans that consider ESG issues because the plan managers who have to make decisions about where to invest your retirement dollars are focusing on these other factors other than predicting financial return. What if someone commits to a green initiative? They receive an influx of cash as a result, and they either abandon it or significantly walk it back in a year or two. The answer to that risk would seem simple at first glance, just sell that one off, right? But when taken to its natural limit, these kind of seesaws where companies are being pushed in and pulled out of certain funds, it's costly for both the investor who could lose money, but also for the plan itself, right? When you invest your dollars in a 401k and someone is charged with managing that 401k, there are costs that are associated with that. Giving plan managers these additional factors to track when making decisions where to invest your money increases the cost of a fund that has ESG factors to be considered in it because there are extra things for those plan managers to look at. The hit to the bottom line, as I note here, is just another risk to consider. It just plain costs money to convert technologies to entirely recyclable materials, or to build a new and more efficient factory that runs on a new type of energy source. Just the same as it would cost you and me as consumers if we all decide to convert to electric cars tomorrow, right? There's a significant price difference right now in the market between buying a gasoline-powered vehicle in most instances and an electric-powered vehicle. These differences have been shown to impact our investments over a longer period of time. In 2019, there was a study that was released that showed that there was a 44% differential between funds that were invested with ESG in mind and funds that were simply invested more generally in the S&P 500. The S&P 500 fund over that decade that was measured outperformed the ESG fund by about 44%. So think about what the difference would be of a 44% gulf for your retirement between what is going on now and what would happen if you were invested in ESG. So 44% is a pretty significant differential in terms of how you might be able to retire when you really think about it. All right, there we go. Okay, so ERISA, the Employee Retirement Income Security Act, was passed in 1974. It covers roughly 54% of the American workforce. If a large percentage of the American workforce begins to see reduced returns as a result of reliance on ESG investing, take a guess as to who's going to be footing that bill. You, your children, the American taxpayer, in short. And this is precisely what the current system is designed to avoid whenever possible. Before ERISA was passed, lots of Americans either weren't invested in a retirement plan with their employer, they were just kind of socking money away in the bank, or they were in a plan administered by their employer where it was purely run by and in the interest of the employer. So there was a lot of funny business going on. Company officials could simply pull money from the till, that sort of thing. And a lot of folks who were invested in such plans really had no information available to them about their retirement. So what ERISA did was it not only implemented a number of incentives to save for retirement that we'll talk about in a moment, but it also mandated a very strict disclosure scheme by which the retirement plans were required to tell you as the employee where those funds were being invested, how much was going toward the administration of that plan, and that sort of thing. So you may get, if you're a part of a 401k plan, you probably get an annual disclosure. Maybe you read it, maybe you just throw it in the garbage, but those disclosures are very important because prior to 1974, they were not universally mandated in this way. And a lot of folks who had their retirement dollars tied up with their employer really had no idea what was going on and whether there were any better options with which to invest their money. So with ERISA and its incentives, we're now at a point where many employers, both large and small, take advantage of tax advantages to offer retirement plans as a valuable benefit. And this is why the distinction that I mentioned to you a few minutes ago about what you might purchase at the store as a personal value decision versus how selections are made for your 401k is so important. Your retirement plan is about you, but it's not just about you. You are saving for retirement. You're incentivized to do that by the structure in ERISA. But you're not spending a lot of your time day trading and picking the investments. Your job is to work for the employer. The plan manager's job is to take those funds that are set aside from your paycheck and to invest them prudently or responsibly. It's important to consider, as well as the impact on you, the impact that it's going to have on the public if they have to carry you through in your retirement years if some or all of that money is gone. And that's why there are certain procedures and mechanisms within ERISA that are operate as carrots and sticks that make it different than simply going to the store and buying something off the shelf, or even going into the stock market on your own with some other disposable income and buying a particular company's stock. The 401k is different than that in this regard. So common ERISA features that we're used to seeing. Your pre-tax money will get invested and it grows without you having to pay taxes on it every year. The money you invest today gets to grow tax-free, generally speaking, until you retire. That's a huge benefit, as even taking into account market downturns and the risk of some losses over time, as we have, bull and bear markets. You'll almost certainly make more money having those funds invested than you would if you had just put it in a bank, stuffed it in your mattress, or selected other investments that you have to pay tax on the gain every year. Employers likewise are incentivized to offer these plans and to match contributions where they can, because they get deductions as well for putting that in. So those are kind of the carrots, why we want to use this system to retire. And then the sticks are, of course, that you can't just take the money out to go on a family vacation or buy yourself a new car. It's not readily available to you. These funds are set aside and provided this beneficial tax treatment specifically for the purpose of shoring up your retirement. This is why if you do borrow against your 401k or attempt to withdraw early, you're severely penalized for doing that. The funds are supposed to be there for when you're out of the workforce, not just used for anything that the employee may want or need. The principles are similar to and derived from the law of trusts. To illustrate this, I'll give you just a trust example. If we have a wealthy woman who leaves her granddaughter money through her will, she leaves it in a trust for her daughter, her granddaughter, let's say, for the purposes of funding her college education. The granddaughter cannot come along at age 16 and demand that the money be used to buy her a pony. The pony might be cheap at twice the price. The pony might be a rescue. The pony might provide really great mental and physical health benefits for the granddaughter. All of these things can be true, but it doesn't matter because the money was set aside for the purpose of funding her college education, period. ERISA and retirement, the principles are basically the same way. The investment in the 401k is set aside to fund your retirement. It's not set aside for any pet projects that you might want to do. It's not set aside to support political candidates or political causes. It's set aside for your retirement, and that is the purpose for which it is set aside, and therefore the reason that Congress authorized these great tax benefits and the structure from which we're all benefiting. So here are some of the terms that you might see commonly thrown around in the ERISA context. I'm not going to spend a ton of time going over the legalese of fiduciary duty or the duty of prudence or the duty of loyalty. But the bottom line here is that the managers who are charged with managing the funds in your 401k have, for the last 50 years at least, been bound by the concept of fiduciary duty. And the basics of fiduciary duty are that the fiduciary, here the plan manager, is to place your interest above theirs. It's the easiest way that I can put it. So what happens when you mix ESG and ERISA? ERISA requires in the statutory text that plan fiduciaries act solely in the best interest of plan participants and beneficiaries. So who are plan participants? Plan participants are essentially you and me, right? We're workers who are investing in a 401k through an employer, and the beneficiary is either myself when I retire. I'm probably going to be the primary beneficiary of my own retirement account. But if I pass on, if I'm not around, if I've designated my spouse or my children or my brother, that's a beneficiary designation. And so the fiduciary duty of the plan manager is to ensure that the account grows so that when I hit retirement age or pass on and the funds become available to the beneficiary, that the interests of myself or the beneficiaries is put first. The plan manager can't have a personal benefit from it. The plan manager can't argue that there's some larger good for society benefit if he selects a particular investment. And the Supreme Court of the United States has generally agreed with this analysis. It's defined the term benefit as a financial benefit. That was in a 2014 decision that was actually unanimous, 9-0. There are a number of these decisions where retirement questions like this are brought into brought before the Supreme Court, and unlike a lot of contentious issues that we see that divide the court 5-4, 6-3, many of these ERISA decisions are either 8 or 9-0, depending on what the issue is. So lots of people say, okay, well, what's the big deal? Don't I get a choice? When I joined my employer, didn't I fill out a form that said I choose this particular fund? Therefore, isn't it fine? Can't we just let people who want to do ESG do ESG? Well, yes and no. I mean, the choices that you're offered when you enter into a 401k generally are based on your risk tolerance. But at the same time, the duty of prudence, one of the duties imposed by ERISA on these plan fiduciaries, encompasses a continuing obligation to review all of the options offered by the plan and to weed out the ones that are known to be poor performers. The fiduciary is not allowed to offer options he or she knows to be a loss leader or to charge higher fees to administer, or that aren't diversified enough. Those are the three main issues from which many ESG options suffer. The way that I like to put it, I guess, in terms of trying to draw an analogy here, the fiduciary is required to always evaluate the plan options to see what's going to perform. There might be options that perform better than other options, but if there are truly poor options that are too risky, not diversified enough, or too costly, they need to be removed. Your plan does not operate like a game of let's make a deal. There's not supposed to be a zonk behind curtain number 3. The prize behind curtain number 3 might be the furniture set as opposed to the car that you want, but they're both valuable investments, valuable prizes on return. So that's kind of an old-time game show way of looking at it. But in all seriousness, the folks who are in charge of the plans are in charge of guarding those funds and ensuring to the best of their ability that they are prudently invested. And so the fact that somebody wants to go and take a gamble based on ESG factors isn't really the determining factor. The determining factor is the investment prudent? And the political aspect of this is not supposed to play into it one way or the other. So as we discussed, ERISA and trust principles mean that these fiduciaries are supposed to manage the assets for the benefit of someone else, not for themselves and not for your employer. They're being managed for the benefit of the employee and those beneficiaries that they designate. This is often referred to in court cases as the highest duty known to the law, a fiduciary duty. And even certain transactions undertaken in complete good faith could be invalidated because of how strict the limits are on certain prohibited transactions under ERISA. So how does this all play into federal rulemaking and what we're here to discuss today and what the Biden administration is doing? So many of you are probably familiar pretty generally with how our system of government works at the federal level. Congress passes the laws, the president signs them. Federal agencies were created by Congress and are generally generally charged with enforcing these federal laws. For example, Congress passes the tax code. The IRS or the Treasury Department then creates specific rules, many thousands of pages of them, as to how those laws will be enforced, how certain terms could be defined and applied. But there are limits to this. Congress can't just turn over all of its power to a particular federal agency, and it needs to be within the delegation authorized by Congress. For example, the Department of Education isn't going to be making decisions about the benefits that our military veterans receive. The Environmental Protection Agency is not designed or tasked with enforcing the labor laws. And so one of the issues that we're going to be talking about here, the prudent investor rule that is at issue in some litigation that we are bringing and that seeks to introduce these ESG factors into retirement decisions, is promulgated by the Department of Labor, but it's very heavily influenced by a desire to implement a response to climate change. So it's really a backdoor environmental regulation in many ways. And so that is part of the issue that we're facing with federal rulemaking today. So looking at the rule in context, we're going to go back a little bit. And since at least the early 90s, there's been some interest by investors in selecting investments for reasons in addition to financial return. The general rule over the last 30 years, up until just very recently, in both Republican and Democratic administrations, has been that financial return comes first when it comes to these retirement investments. It's always been that financial return comes first and foremost, and that any collateral or social objectives are ancillary and can't subvert the financial interest. What does this mean? This means that if there is a choice between a couple of companies to buy stock in as part of a retirement plan or part of a retirement fund, and they're both otherwise about equivalent financial risk. They've looked at the demand, the prospects, the market, everything, and they've said, okay, company X and company Y, roughly equivalent, but maybe company Y also contributes to some social good. So if two building supply companies are both being considered, but company Y focuses on providing affordable housing, you could pick that one based on the extra factor. It's kind of a tiebreaker. But you can't pick the affordable housing provider if their financials are bad, because then you would be subverting financial return to another consideration rather than focusing on maximizing the return for the shareholders. The 2020 Trump era rule is consistent with that past practice. ESG investing has been on the radar increasingly in recent years. During the Trump administration, the Department of Labor promulgated a rule that mirrored many of the features of the earlier rules that I just talked about. It explicitly required considerations of financial return to be paramount, but it allowed ESG factors to be considered in limited circumstances, basically where the investments could otherwise be equivalent or better. The rule also required managers who selected based on ESG factors to show their work when they considered those factors, to be able to demonstrate to investors why financial considerations weren't sufficient to make a choice, and to document how those ESG factors were considered. This in practice would protect both the employee, who would via disclosures be aware of what's going on, and the fiduciary. So if the employee sues the fiduciary claiming that the investment choice was imprudent, the justification for the decision would be right there. So to explain how this operates in practice, let's consider just a consumer example. Taking this out of the 401k context for just a minute, but to give you an idea of how the Trump rule and the prior rules generally worked. Let's say that I'm out shopping for Easter decorating supplies for my kids. I'm buying Easter baskets, egg coloring kits, decorations, other associated things. I see that two stores, Michael's and Hobby Lobby, both have the products that I want. I look at the ads and I look at the availability online. They have everything that I'm looking for, and they're about the same price. They're within a couple of cents. I look at how long it's going to take me to drive to either store. They're about equidistant from my home. So these two are relatively equal. But if I decide that, all right, all other things being equal, I want to patronize Hobby Lobby because I respect the fact that they give their employees Sundays off to observe the Sabbath, then I'm essentially making that choice based on an ESG factor, a social factor that I think is important to me. But I did so all of the things being equal. How this compares with the proposed rule from the Biden administration is quite different, as you can see on the screen here. So going back into the retirement investing context, immediately upon taking office in 2021, President Biden suspended the Trump rule. He claimed it discriminated against ESG investments and made it so that people would not want to invest in them. Of course, this ignores the bottom line, which is that if these investments are profitable, if these considerations contribute to a positive change in the company's bottom line, they win anyway. They win whether you like the fact that the company is going green or not. If they're making more money than under the rules that have been in place forever, basically, they would win. But this administration was seeking not just to eliminate the supposed bias against ESG, but to actively encourage its use as an investment strategy. And this is shown in the proposed rule that it put out in the fall of 2021. The summary to this rule included some suggestions as to what factors could be appropriately considered when investing your retirement dollars. These factors explicitly included a company's use of diversity in hiring, whether the company employed a union versus a non-union workforce, whether the company was actively engaged in fighting climate change, and whether the investment would conflict with the esprit de corps of the employee's company. So that was the original proposal. It included language that directed that fiduciaries making investment decisions, those decisions may often require consideration of these ESG factors. So that, at least as far as many commentators, including myself, are concerned, put a thumb on the scale in favor of ESG investments. It was not simply a plan to eliminate perceived bias against them. So you can see here that there are some differences I've outlined on the slide between the Trump rule and the first rule that President Biden proposed. Just a little bit of an explanation on the last, the last two items. So the disclosure requirements, as I mentioned, under the Trump rule, plan managers who are making decisions based on ESG factors were required to document how and why they did so. Under the proposed Biden rule, there was no requirement for that. And then the default option that I have listed under the Trump rule, under President Trump's rule, you could not be defaulted into an ESG fund. So oftentimes when you join an employer for the first time and you are given the retirement plan materials, you make a selection, you go into a certain plan for saving toward retirement, and that's done. But what happens if you receive the materials and you don't return them? Generally speaking, you can be defaulted into what's called a qualified default investment option, or QDIA. Under the Trump rule, in order to protect people who had not made an affirmative election of any kind, you could not use ESG considerations in a QDIA. The Biden proposed rule eliminated that protection and said that any fund could have ESG considerations considered. Now, the proposed rule from 2021 is not what is in effect today, but it is what the administration originally wanted. And as a result of putting that out there, when there is federal rulemaking, there is, generally speaking, a comment period of at least a few months. In this case, over 22,000 comments were received in support and against the proposed rule in about a 3-month period. And it took the administration nearly a year to finalize the rule following the receipt of all of these comments. And that is because part of an agency's obligation under the Administrative Procedures Act is to take into account all significant comments. Because there are comments both for and against, you don't have to agree or to address every single comment, but the major issues that are raised by those comments need to be considered by the agency or the rule can be invalidated. While many people did object to the rule, in particular, the may often require ESG consideration language, there were a number of groups that filed comments either cheering it or even proclaiming that it did not go far enough. However, there was sufficient outrage over the may often be required language from a vast cross-section of the community to drive at least some change to the proposed rule. So the result was the final ESG rule, which we, as we'll be discussing in a few minutes, are currently challenging. On December 1st of 2022, the administration issued its final rule through the Department of Labor. While it removed the provision that prudent investment decisions may often require a consideration of ESG, it nevertheless gave these factors a special place in the investment decision calculus because the rule now defines ESG factors as appropriate risk-return factors for determining an investment's performance. It should be noted that no other factor, including traditional objective factors like stock price, units sold, profitability last year, those sorts of things, is specifically listed in the rule or defined as a risk-return factor appropriate for consideration. So even though the rule no longer says that consideration is required or may often be required, and so it's not technically mandatory in the sense that we're not telling somebody that they must or cannot do something, The rule follows a pattern by defining these factors, including climate change, diversity initiatives, all sorts of the ESG factors that we've been discussing today, simply defining them as appropriate risk return factors. And this follows a pattern for this administration, where the administration simply defines a term that it wants defined in a certain way in order to create a rule on it or to drum up support for it. You can see this in a lot of different contexts. You could, for example, we've seen language changed over the last year where we define a pregnant biological female who identifies as transgender as a pregnant man. That is, this isn't too much different from that in terms of just redefining what a risk return factor is by simply saying that climate change or these other ESG factors would qualify. So what is a risk return factor? That's not really defined in the rule either, but it's presumably a metric that would provide some material impact on an investment's risk or its return. And by its nature, if there is a financial risk that we know about, that already needs to be disclosed and considered by fiduciaries. So what does this look like in practice? If company X makes widgets in 3 factories and the biggest factory burns down, there's no doubt there's going to be a negative impact on risk and return. We can probably even estimate what it is. Maybe we know that we can increase productivity in the second factory by adding a shift, but we can't do that in the third. And maybe we know how long it's going to take us to rebuild the main factory. So we can project a range of what we think the possible loss could be and when we're going to be able to recover from it. But try that with an ESG factor. Let's say that the company's new initiative commits to put at least 3 women on a 9-person board. If somebody in the audience right now can tell me what the financial impact of doing that is to the company's bottom line, I'd love to hear it. I know I can't tell you, but what I can tell you is that if you could, and assuming that it's a positive impact, you wouldn't need an ESG rule like the Biden administration has proposed to encourage that change, because it would already be profitable and you'd presumably already be doing it. So the default prior to the rule was that the most profitable investments won out, no matter the politics. Under the new rule, it's not exactly clear that that's going to continue to be the case. Defining ESG factors as risk return factors cracks the door open so that those who want to make these decisions based on politics now have the authorization, if not the requirement, to do so. And that is what is disturbing, at least in my opinion, about the new rule. So after this rule came out, what's happened so far? Congress actually did take some action on this. At the end of February, the House of Representatives passed a resolution condemning the ESG rule for many of the reasons that we've been talking about today, and including most notably that it was introducing partisanship and these high-stakes political issues that are currently being hotly debated in society, but not being passed through Congress, into retirement investing, where they've never really played a role and don't belong. So the House passed a resolution saying repeal this rule. The Senate agreed the following day, and it was presented to President Biden on March 9th. In the process, I have to put in a little plug for Will here, but the House Speaker, Kevin McCarthy, actually commended us for our actions with regard to the rule at the same time that he was signing this resolution and sending it to the president's desk, because we at Will have been challenging this rule as an overreach of the Department of Labor's authority. We have 2 clients from Waukesha County who stand in the shoes of the over 140 million people who are affected by the rule. And you can see our client, Fred Lewis, with House Speaker McCarthy here in this photograph. But unfortunately, after all of this, President Biden chose to ignore Congress and vetoed the bill earlier this week. So we are now at a point where the president has decided that he is plowing ahead with this rule. He has disregarded Congress's input on the issue. What is most puzzling and particularly troubling about this is that the president has represented that The effort to overturn the rule is partisan gamesmanship and has faulted MAGA Republicans and specifically Representative Marjorie Taylor Greene for some reason for the passage of the resolution, when in fact there were actually a number of Democrats who either crossed over the aisle or abstained from voting on the issue. So it did get majorities in both chambers. It's a bipartisan resolution, and the president chose instead to side with some of the far left constituencies instead of with the American worker. At least that's how we see it. So with that in mind, we here at Will have filed a lawsuit in the Eastern District of Wisconsin in which we are challenging the rule. As I mentioned, our plaintiffs are from here in Waukesha County, but they could be any Americans in a 401k anywhere, and they stand in the shoes of all of those who do. So we have filed a lawsuit against the Secretary of Labor seeking to invalidate the ESG rule. We're arguing in essence that altering the nature of the fiduciary duty that I've been talking about this morning, which until this point has been incredibly strict and very focused on maximizing return for all investors, to undercut that, to allow consideration of factors that could have a negative impact on the return simply because there are constituencies out there who like them politically, is contrary to ERISA. And it's contrary to the Administrative Procedures Act, because an agency like the Department of Labor can't exercise authority that Congress didn't give it. There are definitely people who want ESG considered, whether conservative or liberal, but as I discussed earlier this morning, that really doesn't matter. The purpose of the funds in a retirement account is not to support political causes. It's to incentivize saving and to maximize saving for retirement, to relieve burdens on the American taxpayer later. So that's the very high level overview of the lawsuit that we currently have going here in federal court in Milwaukee. We have asked the court to enter a preliminary injunction stopping the rule. The government will be filing a response in, I believe, next week, and then we will finish the briefing and hopefully the court will render a decision soon. But that is, we're in the very early stages of that lawsuit and working very hard to try to take the politics back out of this and return our retirements to the status to which they belong. There is one other lawsuit out there that's challenging the rule. 25 states and a couple of private individuals and companies filed a lawsuit in the Northern District of Texas at the end of January. That suit also remains pending. They have also asked a judge down there in Texas to stop the rule, and nothing has, to my knowledge, happened there quite yet. So we're awaiting rulings in both cases, and we will see. So I mentioned at the outset of today's presentation that the ESG initiatives that the Biden administration is pushing go not toward just this rule, but to other rules as well. So no matter how the current lawsuits play out, the administration has made it clear that ESG is a priority for it. In addition to the investment rule, the Securities and Exchange Commission is finalizing or expected to finalize very soon new regulations that would require publicly traded companies to include disclosures about climate change and its effect on the business, whether it's relevant to profitability or not. The draft of those regulations, and I emphasize draft because we don't yet know what the final is going to look like, but the draft would also require those companies to disclose the greenhouse gas emissions information for every single company in its supply chain, up and down. We've seen recent efforts to ban stoves and other appliances that use natural gas. We are seeing other ESG sort of impacts in terms of grant making proposals. There's even a rule out there that's been proposed that would take into account the effects of climate change when bidding, when soliciting bids for the folks who want to supply rocket fuel to our space program. So really, this is a far-reaching sort of climate change themed, but also broader ESG themed initiative that is out there. All right, so you may ask at this point, what can I do if I think that this is a problem? Unfortunately, in light of the current rule, which does not require the same fulsome disclosures that the Trump rule did if ESG is to be used, there's not a ton that you can do. But I would say you can certainly, as a practical matter, stay informed, keep an eye on the disclosures that you receive from your retirement plan. If you're in a 401k, actually read them. Consider whether you want to try to ask questions of the helpline or others who are listed on those disclosures. You can call and ask your HR department if they know whether ESG factors are being considered, although it's more likely going to be folks at a brokerage house or other plan manager who would have that information. The bottom line is, because there's no disclosure requirement in the new rule, it's not really that easy to determine whether ESG factors are being used to decide where your retirement funds are being invested. You could, however, try to ask those questions and try to ask whether there are funds available that do not use those considerations, if that is a concern for you. And one other note that I do want to point out, there are probably a lot of you here who think that I'm ragging on financial advisors, or think that financial advisors or fiduciaries are out to funnel this money to ESG causes. And I don't believe that to be the case for the majority of folks. There are probably many out there who recognize the risks inherent in relying on these factors without justification for doing it. And I do believe that the vast majority of financial advisors and fiduciaries really do have their clients' best interests at heart. But what the concern here is quite simply that cracking the door open on a previously airtight single motivation system with one goal in mind, to maximize the retirement dollars, cracking the door open on that to allow these other considerations that really can't be tracked, aren't required to be tracked, and have at least to date been shown not to necessarily be as financially profitable, it runs a risk. It's a risk to the bottom line. It's an end run around the checks and balances in terms of trying to make environmental policy through these investments. And it's bad because it affects a very large portion of the American workforce. So to the extent that these considerations can be used and are not being disclosed to you as a retirement investor, that's where I believe a lot of the real harm is, in addition to the potential dollars that could be lost. But I just wanted to make that note, because I don't mean to sound like I'm ragging on fiduciaries. And I do think that on the whole, most fiduciaries really do want to do a good job by you and to invest your retirement dollars properly. But this rule allows for these considerations to play a role that they previously did not, and frankly should not. So I know I've been talking for quite a while, so I will be taking questions here in a moment. But if you are so inclined, as I mentioned at the outset, Will is a 501c3 nonprofit corporation. We represent clients in the public interest, like our challenge to the ESG rule, and we don't charge for our time. So if you feel inclined to support our efforts, I would encourage you to visit our website at will-law.org and consider contributing to us. And with that, I am happy to take any questions. It looks like we have one in the chat. What can we do to fight the politicization of our retirement accounts? So that's a good question. I wish I had a more optimistic answer for you. But as I mentioned, I think the best thing to do is to speak up, get involved. I think the more people who basically let their plan managers know that they oppose these sorts of decisions and considerations, well, somebody could just disregard those comments, I suppose. Most fiduciaries don't want to get sued. They don't want to be worrying about these options. And so I suspect that if enough people speak up about these issues, we'll at least see the potential that non-ESG funds will be offered, and perhaps even shying away by some fiduciaries from applying these factors. Okay, let's see here. Could I discuss the role proxy firms play in the larger ESG movement? That's an excellent question, and one that I will candidly say I'm not able to discuss at length today. But what I will say is that one of the other initiatives that's actually packed into this rule, but does not go into effect until the end of this year, is that retirement funds that often in the past have not voted the shares of 401k participants in certain issues when it comes to corporate governance are now being encouraged to do so. So proxy firms are going to play a significant role going forward, probably beginning in December. But I would be remiss if I said that I knew, as I sit here today, exactly how that's going to play out. So unfortunately, I don't have a great answer for that one, but it's something certainly to watch. Okay, is there specific language or are there buzzwords in financial disclosures that we should be looking for? Great question. So I would say that because a lot of the ESG folks who are supporting ESG investing are looking for this and see it as a positive thing, I suspect that you will see either the acronym ESG or you will see sort of synonyms for that, right? Environmental, social, diversity. We support, these and these sorts of companies. So there might be a fund that's even entitled ESG fund or, the Green Initiative Fund. It might be in the title of the fund. It might be in a description of the fund, in a summary plan description, or in an annual disclosure that you receive that lists out the menu plan options from which you can select. But in terms of, are there specific code words beyond that? To this point, I haven't seen any, but that doesn't mean that they won't be developed. Let's see. Isn't this just another tool to go after gun manufacturers and the oil industry? I suppose it could certainly be seen that way. The oil industry for sure is not helped by the rule. Which again promotes the use of these, climate change factors as positives for investments. So it does seem to be, at least in that regard, a way to put the thumb on the scale against some of the more traditional fossil fuel energy concerns, which over the last several years, especially, as anyone who knows who is going to be filling their gas tank at $5 a gallon last summer would know, that the fossil fuel companies did very, very well. And if you weren't invested in those, then you were missing out. So it'll be interesting to see how that plays out. Let's see. Got a couple more here. Would Will be willing or able to design a template letter for average Americans to give our investment plans? That's an interesting thought. I will take that up with the group. Are you seeing a trend for companies to start looking at reducing their DEI ESG commitment? We've been hearing that companies are starting to assess that it isn't contributing to profitability. There is some of that. There are some the brokerage houses where, such as Vanguard, that used to be very committed to putting their money behind ESG investing, and a recent letter from, I believe, their CEO or their CFO that was published about a month or two ago indicates that they are backing off of that somewhat. But there are others who are really all in and gangbusters on this stuff in order, again, to kind of satisfy those constituencies that seem to want it. So there may be some reticence in an attempt to back off of that. Given the challenges like the ones that we filed and the attention that's been brought to the issue, especially after the market downturn that we saw last year, which did, at least based on what I've read, hit ESG investments harder than investments that were not selected on that criteria. But as far as, is this going away? I don't think we're going to see this going away anytime soon. All right, it looks like I've answered, or at least attempted to answer, all of the questions that have been posed. And so I thank all of you very much for your time today. I really appreciate your time and your attention, and hope that you found this informative, and wish everybody a great day.